haven, preserving the eternal annals of Warhammer.
In the dying light of the segmentum obscurus, where the stars themselves flicker like the fading embers of a once glorious pyre, a silence hangs across the void that no voxcaster can breach, no war cry can shatter. It is a silence of judgment, the stillness that precedes collapse. An empire of 1,000,000 worlds, each once burning with ambition, conquest and pride, now lies hollowed, its bones adrift in the dark. And through this decay echoes the low thunder of drums not played by human hand. The Orks had come, but not as they had before. They came not as raiders or scattered warbands lost in the tides of the void, but as a green flood driven by a voice far more ancient than any War ever known. A voice not born of instinct or battle lust, but of purpose, coherence, vision, and at the center of it all, standing atop a shattered imperial citadel where banners still flapped like torn shrouds in the windless dusk, was Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka. But this is not his story. No, this is the tale of the last Lord Solar of Segmentum Obscurus, Veltrax Kaur, a man whose name would be whispered in the shadow of burning cathedrals and forgotten in the victory songs of the Xenos. A man whose heart broke not from the hammer of war, but from the slow gnawing of doubt. His was the final mind that dared believe unity could be reforged, that something sacred still lingered beneath the bureaucracy, the stagnant nobility, and the corruption that had consumed the stars. And in the end, it was his belief that damned him. Veltrax stood on the edge of the Black Aegis Bastion, the last orbital spire of Caldrith Secundus. The planet's surface below was veiled in smoke, ash from burned crops, charred manufactorums, and the crushed remains of billions ground into dust beneath green feet. He gazed out toward the fading corona of the sector's primary sun. It wept red, bleeding away its light in waning pulses, a fitting crown for a dying realm. He had not spoken to the High Lords in weeks. What remained of the Astra Militarum forces answered only to their own survival instincts now, fractured into isolated holdouts. And the Navy, what hadn't been pulled into the warp by storms, had retreated to Euston Reach, abandoning the segmentum to fester. Still, he waited, not for reinforcements, nor for absolution from terror. He waited for her. A voice, long buried beneath centuries of war and statecraft. A presence he had once exiled from thought for the sake of duty, yet which had never truly left him. He had made a choice long ago, one that forged his career and severed his soul. And now, as the world crumbled, she was returning. He remembered the last time he saw her. Inquisitor Lyrae Vos, Ordo Xenos, bearer of heretical knowledge, and the last woman he ever trusted. He had once believed in her, just as he believed in the strength of the Imperium. But when she uncovered the truth of what stirred beneath the Ork consciousness, when she spoke of a will coalescing in the psychic void of the War, he did what his duty demanded. He denounced her, called for her execution, watched her burn, or so he believed. And now, across the vox ghosts of dead systems, her voice had returned. Veltrax, the Wat is listening. It sees you, it remembers, and it is not what you think. The words had come a week ago. No ship, no signal trace. Just a voice in the static, hers unmistakable, unmarred by time. That was when the dreams began. Dreams of green stars and spires shaped not by human architecture, but by instinct, by war, by something primal made divine. Dreams where he stood among the Orks, not as prey, but as part of something larger, something alive. He dared not tell anyone. Even now, as he stood in full regalia, The aquila cracked on his chest plate and blood dried into the seams of his storm cloak. He heard them murmuring in the hallways. Officers accusing him of withdrawal, of madness. Some said he turned. Others claimed he prayed to the emperor for death, but the emperor no longer listened. They were all wrong. He wasn't afraid of death. He feared hope, for in that hope lay the terrifying truth. The Orks had changed, and worse still, they were learning, thinking. The Imperium was built on assumptions. One such assumption was that the Orks would never truly unite, that they could never plan. They were a disease, yes, but a stupid one, predictable, containable. But what if they weren't? He turned back into the dim interior of the command sanctum. Vox scribes chanted into silence. Augur priests fiddled with disconnected readouts. The glow of the hololith showed dozens of systems in ruin, burned from orbit, their atmospheres consumed in fungal clouds. Gazkul had not come alone. Something moved behind him, a force that could not be named, only felt. A collective pressure against the psychic skin of the galaxy, an idea, an evolution. The Tyranids were one kind of hive, but this was something raw, less perfect, more human. He approached the vault that had remained sealed for decades, his personal archive. Within it, the final recordings of Lyrae's inquisitorial treatises, the ones never submitted to Terra, the ones she begged him to read before the verdict. He had refused. Now, he entered the vault alone. The cold, sanctified steel hissed open, revealing a dimly lit chamber layered with data scrolls, purity seals, and sealed vox crystals. He knelt before one. There was no ceremony, no ritual, just a man unmaking his oath, piece by piece. He activated the crystal. Her voice returned, cracked with age but sharp with fire. If you are hearing this, Veltrax, it means the moment has come. The Orks are changing. A latent consciousness is blooming across them. Not singular, not central, but networked, like fungi, like roots. One Ork thinks, and others follow. They are becoming. He closed his eyes. He had ordered her death for this heresy, for this madness, but she was right, and that truth was heavier than any Ork weapon. He stepped out into the cold, watched the clouds above swirl in toxic green, and felt the first tremors of war shake the spire beneath his feet. They were coming, and this time they would not be defeated by tanks or faith or numbers, not even by exterminatus, for this was not a war. It was an awakening, and the Imperium was not ready. The horizon of Caldrith Secundus burned with an unnatural green glow, the flickering of distant lightning storms reflecting in the polluted atmosphere, like the very heavens themselves rejecting the violence of the galaxy. Veltrax Kao stood upon the highest observation platform of the Black Aegis Bastion, his eyes tracing the sky, as though searching for answers in the broken clouds. Beneath him, the command chamber buzzed with whispered reports, cries of dissent, and the frantic rhythms of a dying empire scrambling to patch its fractured defenses. The Orks were not just a threat. They were now a presence, a growing, conscious force, their green tide far more than the unpredictable frenzy of an enemy to be destroyed. It was something else. Gazkul had become the face of this revolution, but the weight of that green madness did not rest solely upon his broad, brutish shoulders. No, Veltrax knew something that no one dared to speak. There were whispers of another power moving within the Ork Empire, something older than the Warg itself, something more deliberate, more dangerous. Lord Veltrax. The voice that called him back to reality was soft, but its tone was ironclad. He turned to see Captain Amara Jorath, his most loyal and yet most troubled officer, stepping into the chamber. She was a soldier, born of the same fire that forged the Imperium's most elite, yet there was something in her eyes, something unspoken, uncertain. Veltrax met her gaze and saw the cracks forming there, the same cracks that had begun to fracture his own resolve. She stood straight, her dark armor gleaming in the dim light, but her voice betrayed the unease of someone who knew too much, yet understood too little. They've begun massing, my lord. In sectors 6 through 12, it's chaos. All communication with the outer colonies has ceased. We've lost 2 entire fleets. Our long-range auger arrays are picking up something. It's like a pulse, but irregular and growing stronger by the hour. Veltrax didn't respond immediately. Instead, he paced slowly across the room, his mind awash with the fragmented voices of his command, the knowledge of impending collapse closing in from all sides. "I know," he muttered at last, his voice distant, tinged with exhaustion. Amara stepped forward, her expression softening. "What is it, my lord?" "What aren't you telling us?" Veltrax paused, turning to face her fully, his eyes meeting hers with a weight that only someone who had felt the slow unraveling of an empire could understand. "The Orks have changed," he said quietly. "But it's not just them. It's everything. There's something in the fabric of this war that we are not prepared for." Amara shook her head, disbelief flickering across her features. "But they're just Orks. We've fought them for centuries, and we've always won. How could they—" Veltrax's gaze hardened. "This is not the same enemy. I've seen it. I've heard it. They have a voice now, and it's leading them. Are you saying that Gajkul is more than just a warlord?" Amara's voice trembled, barely above a whisper, as though even uttering the words aloud would make them real. Veltrax looked away, his brow furrowing as he stared at the war maps on the holoscreen. His hands clenched, the old scars beneath his gauntlets itching with the memory of choices made and sacrifices forced upon him. There was no easy answer. There were only choices he could no longer ignore. "Gajkul is a puppet, Captain. The true power behind the Ork War is something older, and it is growing. It calls to them, binds them together in ways we do not understand." Amara stepped back as if struck. "A god? A new god of the Orks?" Veltrax didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The thought unsettled him, but not because it was improbable. It unsettled him because it resonated too deeply with what he had feared for so long. His belief in the stability of the Imperium, the certainty of its invulnerability, was no longer enough. There was something out there in the dark, something ancient and hidden. It was as though the galaxy itself had begun to stir, awakened by the Ork's rise. "I'm afraid it's more than that," he finally said. "It's a will, a sentience, and it's been patient. How long have you known this?" Amara's voice was like ice, cutting through the tension in the room. Veltrax didn't answer right away. "Since I saw her again," he whispered. Amara's face shifted from disbelief to realization. She took a step back, her eyes widening. "Inquisitor Voss?" "Yes." Veltrax nodded, the weight of her name bringing with it the dark history that he had buried for so long. "She warned me before she died." He clenched his jaw, the memory of his betrayal rising like a bitter tide in his chest. He had condemned Lyrae for her heretical beliefs, for daring to question the very foundation of the Imperium. Now, his failure haunted him, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. Amara said nothing. She merely watched him, as though waiting for more, knowing that his burden was far greater than she could imagine. For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the distant hum of the war machines preparing for their final, futile stand. Veltrax turned back to the holoscreen, staring at the swirling chaos of data, at the reports from across the galaxy. But his mind was elsewhere, lost in the quiet whispers of a forgotten truth, a truth that had once been branded heresy. "Captain," he said at last, his voice steady despite the growing storm inside him, "I'm going to find her. We need to understand what's truly happening out there before it's too late." Amara hesitated, but the fire in her eyes was still there, the spark of loyalty and duty that had burned in the hearts of all those who had followed him. "And if you find nothing?" "What then?" Veltrax met her gaze, his lips drawing into a thin line. "Then we prepare for the worst, because we've already lost if we do nothing." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Amara nodded, her resolve clear. "Then I'll gather the fleet." As she turned to leave, Veltrax remained where he stood, watching the flickering lights of the battlefields through the viewport. The galaxy, the Imperium, the very fabric of their existence, they were all in flux. And somewhere, beyond the green tide of Orks, there was something darker moving, waiting for the right moment. And for the first time, Veltrax wondered if it was already too late. In the frozen depths of the obsidian rift, where voidstorms screamed like the echoes of long-dead gods, a single vessel drifted like a shard of memory. The vigilant morning. Cloaked in the shadow of collapsed stars and static-riddled space, it moved without sound, without signature. It was a grave that had not yet claimed its dead. Veltrax Core stood alone in the war-scarred chapel of the ship, his reflection distorted across cracked stained glass. Images of saints with their faces burned away by centuries of blasphemy and war. The candlelight flickered in silence, casting his shadow across the broken altar, where once prayers were whispered and now only regrets echoed. He was a Lord Commander of the Imperium, a strategist of unmatched brilliance, a veteran of the Macarial Crusades, the scourging of Dakanis, and the fall of Halomel. But none of those victories followed him here. Only ghosts and the silence of a truth he had once denied. The vox beside the altar crackled, a whisper cut through static. "Approaching the graven spire, Lord Carl. Arrival in 20 minutes. Orders." Veltrax pressed a hand to the transmitter. "Maintain cloaking protocols. Do not engage. I will disembark alone." There was a pause, then a clipped response. "Yes, my lord." The graven spire was not marked on any stellar chart. It was a dead world circling a black sun, its skies veiled in ancient ash. It had no name, only a designation in inquisitorial records buried beneath cipher and purge order. Lyrae Voss had disappeared here 5 years ago, condemned for speaking truths that cracked the foundations of the Imperium. And now Veltrax returned, not as a judge, but as a man uncertain whether she had been right all along. He descended in silence, alone in a drop capsule that howled through the dying atmosphere. The winds were violent, shrieking across the cracked obsidian plains like the voices of the betrayed. He stepped from the capsule into a world of ruin where every rock was carved with alien script and every breath tasted of rot and memory. He walked toward the tower that loomed at the heart of the valley, a twisted monolith of metal and bone. The graven spire. It pulsed faintly in the fog, not with light, but with something deeper, something alive. His hand lingered on the hilt of his blade, a relic from the earliest days of his command, Vigil's End, a weapon forged in the light of the Emperor's will. But even its weight felt uncertain here. The doors opened not with force, but invitation, as though the spire remembered him, and deep within she was waiting. Lyrae. She had not aged. Her black armour bore the scorched inquisitorial rosette, its edges worn down by centuries of dust and contempt. Her face was gaunt but sharp, a trace of sorrow in her amber eyes. She stood beside a shrine of alien design, its geometry impossible to look at directly. Veltrax stepped forward, breath caught between guilt and fury. I buried your name in the dust. I called you traitor, and yet you came, she said, her voice soft. When the walls began to crack, when the lies could no longer hold the weight of reality. Veltrax's fist clenched. What have you become? She turned to him fully, exposing the brand on her collarbone, the mark of the Ordo Chronos, long thought destroyed. I became what was needed. I walked into the eye. I saw what lies behind the tide, and I returned. He stepped closer, eyes searching hers. The Orks, Gazkul, they're not just uniting. Something's pushing them, something deliberate. Lyrae nodded slowly. A convergence is coming. The Orks are not chaos incarnate. They are creation's hunger made flesh. And now, that hunger has a voice. Veltrax froze. You mean a god? No. She looked past him, through the metal walls of the spire, and into the void. Worse. A memory. The last surviving echo of a species so ancient it predates even the old ones. It was buried, trapped, in the subconscious of the Ork race. Not a deity, but a signal. A thought that repeats. An instinct evolving. He could not move. Her words burned through his soul like warp flame. You're saying the War is a design? Lyrae approached him, placing a hand gently on his chest. We thought we knew them. We thought the Orks were chaos, predictable in their madness, but they are evolving. Something beneath them has remembered what it once was, a galactic will. And now, Veltrax, it dreams of being whole again. The silence that followed was suffocating. Veltrax pulled back. Then we're already too late. This war is a symptom. The real war is for what they might become. Lyrae's eyes dimmed, filled with quiet tragedy. That's why I called you. Because I can't stop it alone. You still have influence in the Segmentum Obscurus. You still command fleets. Veltrax turned away, staring into the dark of the corridor beyond her shrine. My command is crumbling. The Imperium is blind, deaf, and afraid. They would rather let a world burn than listen. Then we find another way. He turned to her. There is no other way. We would be labelled heretics the moment we speak of this. And I already hear whispers of rebellion in my own officers, Lyrae. Placed something into his hand. A fragment of metal etched with shifting runes that shimmered even in shadow. It pulsed faintly with a rhythm, not unlike a heartbeat. This is part of the artifact I recovered from the Ork temple on Krugath's fall. It is not of Ork design. It's pre-Necrontyr, pre-history. And it is waking Veltrax stared at it, feeling something ancient stirring at the edge of his mind. What do you want from me? Truth, she said simply. Truth and choice. I gave mine. Now it is yours. And for a moment, Veltrax felt like a man again. Not a commander, not a servant of empire, but a man standing before the fire of revelation. He closed his fist around the artifact, and the universe trembled. The flickering glow of the artifact remained etched in Veltrax Cow's memory long after he departed the graven spire. It pulsed not with light, but with memory, like a whisper breathed across time. For days he did not speak. The officers aboard the vigilant morning avoided his gaze, whispering behind steel-clad doors, uncertain whether their Lord Commander had returned with truth or madness clinging to his soul. Veltrax stood in his private sanctum, a chamber once adorned with oaths and banners of imperial glory. Now they hung limp and faded, like forgotten prayers. He turned the artifact in his hand, its metal surface warped subtly, as if reshaping itself in response to his thoughts. He was not a man given to superstition, yet each time he looked into its core, he saw visions, not hallucinations, not dreams, but living memory. He saw a time before species, before stars had names, a galaxy where a singular thought moved like a tide, shaping life in crude mimicry of itself. And it had failed. Buried beneath millennia of dust and war, it had waited, fractured, dormant, but not dead. That thought now stirred within the Orks. The implications terrified him, not just of their evolution, but of design, of intention. He turned from the window as a coded chime echoed through the sanctum. "Enter," he said. The doors hissed open, revealing Captain Cyril Vaughan, his second in command. Her armor was scorched and functional, her face carved by years of war and weathered disappointment. She saluted, but there was something different in her posture. Hesitation. "My lord," she said, "High Admiral Crest has withdrawn support from our campaign in the Fornax cluster. Command has deemed your request for reinforcement strategically inadvisable." Veltrax remained silent. She continued, "They've also issued a secondary directive. They want you to report to Terra for a formal inquiry. The charge is vague. Potential deviation from sanctioned doctrine." He nodded slowly. "They know I've seen something." Cyril shifted uncomfortably. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "You may." "What happened on the Graven Spire?" "You went down there alone and returned changed. You burn your own war logs. You stare into the void for hours without moving. Are you still loyal to the Imperium?" Her voice didn't carry accusation. It carried fear. For him. Veltrax looked at her, truly looked, and saw the unspoken terror behind her question. "Am I serving a man who has already fallen, or a man who is about to?" He exhaled slowly. "What I saw cannot be explained within the bounds of sanctioned doctrine. If I speak of it to command, I will be purged. If I speak of it to the ecclesiarchy, I will be branded a heretic." "And if you speak of it to me?" she asked, eyes narrowed. He considered lying, but he had done that enough in this life. "I saw the seed of a memory," he said. "Something older than chaos, older than the stars. It is buried within the Orks, within their DNA, their psychic resonance. Not just war, not just bloodlust, but a design. Something deliberate." Cyril didn't laugh. She didn't scoff. She simply nodded. "Then what do we do?" He was surprised by her calm, but he masked it. "We act while we still have time. The Imperium will not believe. The High Lords will not move until Terra itself is aflame. We must gather those who can still think freely. Scholars, outcasts. The dispossessed. You want to build a conspiracy," she said quietly. "I want to stop a god from awakening in the minds of 10 trillion Orks." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then we'll need allies. Dangerous ones. Veltrax turned away again, staring into the void through his chamber's viewport. "There is one I had hoped never to see again." Cyril frowned. "Who?" He clenched the artifact in his hand. "The Prophet of Iron." Even the name was a curse. A fallen Mechanicus Archmagos exiled for forbidden experiments. A technophile turned zealot. A man who once claimed that the future lay not in purity of machine, but in the corruption of memory. He had tried to merge human minds with the data ghosts of extinct alien civilizations. And he had failed, or so they had believed. I fought to bury him, Veltrax murmured, and now I must dig him up. Elsewhere, beyond the light of imperial stars, the prophet watched the currents of the warp dance across the void. He was no longer flesh. His body had long since become a vault, an archive of stolen knowledge and dying whispers. Tubes writhed through the air like serpents. Optical lenses clicked and zoomed. Binary hymns whispered into the night. He was dreaming. In the dream, a world screamed as it was devoured, not by fire, not by Xenos, but by an idea. A single, ancestral memory echoing through time. War, rage unity through destruction. He awoke, eyes flickering beneath metal lids. It begins, he said softly, and sent out a signal. A pulse across forbidden channels, a gathering. Veltrax was coming, and behind him, whether he knew it or not, so was the tide. The vigilant morning drifted in low orbit over the shattered world of Valus Khan, her hull cloaked in artificial darkness, invisible to imperial augurs. Below, the planet's surface had long since died. Its cities turned to rusted spires, its oceans to poison. Valus Khan was no longer charted on official records, purged from imperial histories after the fall of the 13th Redoubt. Only those who remembered, truly remembered, still knew its name, and the Prophet of Iron had made it his sanctuary. Veltrax's car stood on the silent bridge, watching the world turn. His armor was still stained from the ash of a dozen battlefields, but his thoughts were far removed from war. His grip around the artifact had grown tighter with each passing day. It pulsed now, even without his will. He no longer dreamed of stars, but of roots, of something ancient growing beneath the surface of minds. Not a god, a system, a cycle, a memory given shape. Behind him, Captain Cyril Vaughan read over a data slate filled with fragmented intelligence. No one's entered or left Valus Khan in 30 years. No imperial patrols, no warp traffic, just silence. Perfect place for a resurrection, Veltrax muttered. Cyril glanced at him. Are you sure about this, Commander? The Prophet was exiled for a reason. You killed his work once. He may not welcome you back. He won't, Veltrax said. But he'll listen. The dropship, Morning Echo, burned through the thin atmosphere hours later. The landing zone was a desolate ruin, twisted rebar reaching from the earth like skeletal fingers. But nestled at the center of the husk was a structure untouched by time, a black tower of seamless metal, humming with low-frequency sound, as if it were singing to the dead. Veltrax descended alone, leaving his weapons behind. As he entered the tower's shadow, time itself seemed to bend. The air thickened, walls breathed, light warped. Then came the voice, deep and slow, not from speakers, but from within his mind. You returned. Veltrax took a step forward, heart hammering. I need your knowledge. Need, not want. Curious. You must be desperate. I am, he said. There's something coming. No, not coming. Awakening. In the Orks. In their genome. I found traces. A pattern. A command embedded in instinct, silence stretched. Then, you speak of the root pattern. Veltrax froze. You know of it. Of course, said the voice. I named it. There was a hiss, and a section of the floor receded, revealing a stair descending into darkness. Come, let us speak of old sins, Veltrax descended. The chamber, at the heart of the tower, was like a cathedral constructed by madmen and forgotten machines. Pulsing data conduits slithered across the walls. Glass cylinders contained frozen fragments of alien DNA, and at the center, seated on a throne of iron and bone, was the Prophet of Iron. He was no longer human. What remained of his face was preserved under layers of chrome and living circuits. Wires fed into his skull. Dozens of mechanical arms extended from his back, twitching, writing, building. Veltrax stared at him. What is the root pattern? The prophet leaned forward, metal groaning. Long before your Imperium, before even the rise of the Eldar, the galaxy belonged to a species you do not remember. They were not born. They were grown, each generation sculpted by the last. They lived not as individuals, but as a continuum of memory. Their thoughts were passed down through blood, not words. They were unity incarnate, but they vanished, Veltrax said. There's no trace. They didn't vanish, the prophet interrupted. They reduced themselves. They buried their essence into the basest, most resilient forms of life, a failsafe. And one of those strains, one, became the Orks. Veltrax felt the breath leave his lungs. You're saying the Orks are a vessel? Not just a vessel, a backup, a final code, written in instinct and violence. The root pattern is not just memory, it is purpose. It is war, yes, but also return. One day, the pattern would fully activate, not in one Ork, not in a war boss, but across the entire species, a collective psychic event. A reformation. Veltrax's voice was low. And then what? Then the galaxy ends, the prophet said calmly, or begins again, depending on which side of memory you fall. For a long time, Veltrax said nothing. The silence hung thick between them, filled only by the humming of machines and the clicking of artificial limbs. I came to stop it, Veltrax said, or delay it. The prophet laughed, short, sharp, bitter. You cannot stop a memory. You can only bury it for a time. But I can help you understand it. Veltrax looked up, eyes narrowing. And your price? I want to return to Mars, the prophet said, his voice devoid of emotion. To the forged temples. To the sacred libraries. I want access to what was denied me. If the Imperium is to die, let it die with understanding. That is all I ask. Veltrax turned away. It was treason, high heresy. The prophet of iron was persona non grata, excommunicated and condemned. To even speak his name aloud on Mars was to invite death. And yet, if you lie to me, Veltrax said, I will bury you here myself. The prophet smiled. You already did once, Veltrax Carr. I got better. Veltrax reached into his coat and placed the artifact on the floor. The prophet extended a long, delicate tendril to it, and the room shuddered as data began to transfer, pulsing into the tower's memory banks. The awakening has already begun, the prophet whispered. Do you not feel it? The Orks no longer fight as beasts. They are learning, adapting, building. They have started to remember. Veltrax turned away, a cold dread gnawing at his spine. He thought of the greenskin fleet above Dawn's Hollow, of the Wah banners written in structured code, of the chants that echoed like algorithmic prayers, of the visions. And for the first time in his long, bitter life, Veltrax Carr truly wondered, what if the enemy has already won? The Mechanicus cruiser, thrice blessed entropy, tore through the void, with the elegance of a blade dulled by age, her engines groaning under strain as they surged toward Segmentum Solar. Every bulkhead echoed with the sound of liturgical machine song, praise and penitence in binary. Red-robed acolytes whispered prayers to silicon saints. Tech priests made offerings of sacred oil to reactor cores. The ship was old, older than most Forge worlds remembered, and within its heart sat a secret older still. Veltrax Carr stood in the observation chamber, watching the stars bleed by. Behind him, the prophet of iron knelt within a containment shrine, hunched over a data tablet etched with living code. It was the first time the exiled mindsmith had seen the stars in over a century, and he regarded them now with hollow reverence, like a man standing over a grave too long unvisited. "I will not be welcomed," the prophet said, without looking up. "You know that." Veltrax nodded. "You will not be welcomed. But you will not be stopped." Such confidence. The prophet's voice was a mix of mockery and melancholy. "As if you still believe in control." Veltrax turned. "If I didn't believe in control, I wouldn't still be fighting." He left the chamber without another word. The journey to Mars took 6 more days through the broken veins of the Imperium. Every system they passed was scarred. Dead stars. Drift fleets filled with corpses. Ork signals flickering on long-range Auspex, whispering through the black like ancestral ghosts. The Orks were moving. Not randomly, not wildly, with purpose. Like veins moving blood toward a heart. On the 4th day, a message arrived, encrypted, from her. Veltrax read it 3 times before his mind accepted the words. "They know. The Inquisition has begun a purge of Valus Khan. Your name is on their list. The Ordo Machinum has demanded your immediate apprehension. I held them off, for now, but they are watching. You once told me the line between heretic and prophet is timing. You are nearly out of time. Magos Elite Talrena." Veltrax crushed the tablet in his gauntleted hand. When the red sands of Mars finally filled the viewport, it felt like returning to the bones of an old god. Ancient, glorious, and no longer forgiving. Towers of crimson steel rose into the thin atmosphere like sacred spears. Machine prayers drifted through the electromagnetic field like incense. Orbit was locked, shielded, and patrolled by ships shaped like reliquaries. They did not fire upon the entropy. They simply waited. Veltrax walked the causeway, flanked by Skitari and battle servitors. The prophet behind him, bound in electro shackles designed not for containment, but for symbolism. "See," they said, "even now we remember your crimes." At the Hall of Echoes, they were received not by the Fabricator General, but by a silent conclave of red-robed Archmagi. No names, no greetings, just flickering eyes behind lenses and silence thick enough to choke on. At the center stood Tal Rayna. Her face was more machine than flesh now, her voice layered with vox harmonics. But Veltrax recognized the intensity in her stare. She had not changed, not where it mattered. "You brought him here," she said without preamble. "I need him," Veltrax answered. "You read my reports." "The route pattern." "I read your reports," she interrupted. "I also saw the planetary burn on Dawn's Hollow. I saw what the Orks did to your fleet, what you let them do. You think your theories justify this? I think we are at the edge of something the Imperium doesn't understand." Talrena's mechadendrites twitched. The Imperium never understands. It endures. That is enough. The Prophet of Iron, bound and silent until now, raised his head. "You have forgotten what endures means," he said softly. "A rotting corpse endures. A machine on repeat endures. But you are supposed to evolve. That is why you turned to metal in the first place." The Archmagi stirred, the sound of shifting robes and whispering logic. Talrena stepped forward. "Why return, heretic? What is it you want from Mars?" "Not want," the prophet replied. "Need. Buried in the vaults of Moravec is an AI core from the pre-Unity Wars. Designation, Athrion. It contains the last coherent model of pre-Orkoid biological weaponry. Within that core lies a counter-signal, a null code that can rewrite the route pattern, or delay it." Possibly Talrena's expression did not change. You expect us to hand over a forbidden relic to a condemned traitor? Veltrax stepped forward. He's not asking. I am, and I know where this ends if we do nothing. We saw the future in their blood. A silence followed. Then Talrina said, "You were always reckless." Veltrax replied, "You were always afraid." It was not an insult. It was grief. After a long moment, she turned to the conclave. "He gets 1 hour in the vault, and if he activates anything he shouldn't, I will atomize him myself." The vault of Moravec had not been opened in over 6 millennia. Inside, the air was so cold even machine lenses frosted. Ancient whisperings echoed from the dark, half-remembered code singing in languages dead before Terra had unified. The prophet moved through it, like a priest among tombs. Finally, they found it, encased in stasis, bound in wards of null silver, the Athrion core. The prophet placed a hand on the device and shuddered. His breathing slowed. The circuits along his spine lit like constellations. "This will take time," he whispered. Veltrax stood watch, but the moment felt wrong. The silence had a weight. He reached for his comm. "Captain Vaughan, status report." The line crackled. Then, "Sir, we have movement. Multiple warp signatures. Not Ork. Imperial. Navy grade. They're surrounding us." Veltrax's stomach turned to ice. Talrina's voice came through next. Urgent, clipped, not without regret. "They've come for you, Veltrax. An order redact a kill team. You were right about everything, except how much time you had." Veltrax turned to the prophet. "How long?" The old machine priest looked up. "To finish." "A day. To survive." "A miracle." Veltrax drew his sidearm, the motion fluid and final. "Then we hold the line." For the second time in his life, Veltrax Carr prepared to commit treason in the name of salvation. And somewhere in the dark, across the stars, the Orks dreamed of unity. The void above Mars ignited. Brilliant lines of light stitched the darkness as Imperial Navy vessels opened fire. Lance beams sighed through space like judgment made manifest. The thrice-blessed entropy answered with defiant growls from its macro cannons. But it was outmatched, outgunned, and, perhaps most damning of all, outlawed. Veltrax Carr's voice rang out across the vox channels of the dying ship, sharp as a blade unsheathed. "All hands, prepare for boarding. Hold the ingress points. Delay them. Buy us 1 hour, one real divine hour." And though no gods answered, the crew obeyed. Deep in the vault, below endless strata of sacred Martian bedrock, Veltrax stood beside the prophet of iron, as the ancient heretic interfaced with the Athrion core. Threads of luminescence danced across the old priest's mechanical spine. The data spirit within the core, a thing older than the Imperium, older than the Emperor, resisted every touch, howling in machine tongue. Veltrax's vox bead hissed with fresh reports. Servitor bays breached, decks Delta and Omicron overrun. Then, kill teams inbound, null masked, psychic suppression fields active. The Inquisition had arrived. Veltrax turned to the prophet. "Can you still finish this?" The heretic did not look away from the stream of flickering code. "I can. But I will not leave this place alive." The words struck harder than any blow. Veltrax had known, of course. Somewhere deep in his fractured heart, he had known the old man would not walk out. Not after this. Not after unlocking the code he had once been exiled for even studying. But now, he heard it spoken, and the weight was real. "You should have told me," Veltrax said, voice low. "I did," the prophet murmured. 1,000 times. In all my silences there was a crash above, a seismic quake shaking the vault like the fist of a god. Dust rained from the ceiling. The prophet's hand trembled over the console. Veltrax turned back to the stairwell. The others would come soon. Assassins in gleaming black. Skitarii loyal to doctrines older than loyalty itself. There would be no reasoning with them. Not here. Not after everything. Footsteps echoed in the lower hall. He checked his pistol. Charged. "Then I'll buy you time," Veltrax said simply. The prophet said nothing, but Veltrax felt it. The quiet grief in the air between them, as though a father were watching a son walk into a storm, knowing it was he who taught him to do so. The first intruders came down the corridor with the efficiency of those trained for a single purpose: termination. 2 inquisitorial agents, clad in void black power armor, arc blades drawn, their minds shielded, their purpose absolute. Veltrax moved like a knife drawn from flame. One shot found a weakness in the first agent's helm, between the reinforced brow and neck seal. The second lunged, blade flashing blue with power field energy. Veltrax caught it with a parry, barely redirecting it before retaliating with a kinetic surge from his augmented gauntlet. The agent staggered. He did not, but he was tiring. More footsteps echoed now. They would keep coming, like ants crawling toward a fire. Veltrax backed toward the vault entrance. Behind him, the prophet's voice changed. No longer merely muttering code, but chanting. A litany of reverse logic, binding the AI core to a sequence that could broadcast its null signal across space via transwarp echo. He was reshaping something that should not exist. Orc psychic gestalt, weaponized instinct. He was turning it inward, into a recursive collapse, and he was killing himself to do it. Veltrax felt a sudden tremor of grief, not for what they would lose, but for what they had never gotten back. Then came a voice through his private channel. Not Tal Rayner, not the prophet, but a voice he knew. "You always believed you were the martyr, Veltrax." His blood ran cold. He turned. Stepping from the shadows came Inquisitor Harkane Vale, clad in deep navy grey inquisitorial robes, reinforced with carapace plating. Eyes as pale as a dying star. Once, years ago, they had fought beside one another on the blasted plains of Forian Reach. Once, they had watched an entire hive devour itself in the wake of orc spores triggered by sonic ritual. Once, they had been brothers in arms, no longer. "You've become the thing we swore to hunt," Harkane said, pistol lowered but not holstered. "I've become what this war needed," Veltrax replied. "You abandoned the throne. I understood it." Harkane took another step forward. "Then tell me, was it worth it? The heresies, the pacts, the prophet?" His tone shifted now, something like desperation cracking the authority in his voice. "We could have stopped this, Veltrax." You and I, Veltrax, looked past him, at the approaching team of Inquisition troopers behind his old friend. 10 seconds, maybe 15, before they charge. "We tried your way," Veltrax said quietly. "It wasn't enough." He raised his pistol. Harkane did the same. For one heartbeat, less than a breath, they stood there. Brothers, traitors, mirrors. Then the air lit with fire. Their duel was short, brutal, and inconclusive. Harkane fell back, wounded but alive. Veltrax stumbled, his side burning, blood seeping into his robes. The prophet's voice reached a crescendo. "Null seed initialized," the old heretic rasped. "The echo begins." Above them, a pulse rippled through the vault, invisible yet screaming in the warp. The Athrion core had activated. It was done, but not before the detonation charge ignited. The Inquisition, perhaps realizing too late, had preemptively set a failsafe. The explosion was not large by Imperial standards, but in a vault of forbidden relics, even a small explosion is an apocalypse. Veltrax turned toward the Prophet one last time. The old man looked up, smiled, and was gone. The world vanished into fire. Somewhere else, somewhere far, the Ork known as Gorshaka da Evergreen, warlord of the Thousand Moors, roared as the vision struck him. Not pain, not fear, but confusion. A pulse, a whisper, a wrongness. He looked skyward. The stars trembled. Something in his mind, deep, ancient, primal, twitched. Dahumis did something, he muttered. The other orcs nearby stirred, unease crawling through them like rot through meat. Gorshaka grinned. They're scared. He flexed his claws. War was coming. But for the first time, he wondered, was it his war? In the hollow silence that followed the vault's annihilation, a signal bloomed. Invisible to most, it pulsed across the skein of the warp like a shard of anti-thought. Neither message nor scream, but something deeper. A recursive frequency rooted in contradiction, seeded with the psychic echoes of Orkish unity, bent inward upon itself. And across the stars, the Orks felt it. Not pain, not fear, not even confusion, but uncertainty. For creatures born of war, made of violence, the feeling was alien, sacrilegious, and yet it spread like fungus on a battlefield left to rot. Across a dozen sectors, wah! Banners stopped rising. Warbands halted mid-rampage. Weird boys gibbered in unintelligible panic as feedback loops exploded in their minds. Mechs reported weapons failing to function, not because they were broken, but because the belief that they should had begun to fracture. On Karath 9, a mech god's idol snapped under its own weight. On Beltras Reach, a wah! Stalled as orcs began arguing not over where to fight, but why. On Nyrak's moon, a horde that had besieged a fortress for 8 years turned upon itself in ritual cannibalism without reason. And far beyond all of this, aboard a ship adrift among solar ghosts, Tal Rayna stirred. She had not expected to live. The stasis casket seal cracked with a hiss that sounded like a sigh. Cool mist spilled into the chamber as she awoke, wrapped in thin membranes of null field gel. Her mind reformed slowly, painfully. Memory returning in ragged pulses. Veltrax, the Prophet, the core, the vault gone. She rose to her feet. Bones ached with the stiffness of full sleep. One arm had been replaced with synth steel. An eye had been regrown. She bore the scars of Martian resurrection, crude, functional, and unforgiven. The chamber's lights were dim, shielded to protect her returning senses. But in the center of the room, hovering in an anti-grav shroud, was a single device. A transmitter, custom forged, etched with warning runes and litanies of containment. It pulsed faintly. She recognized the signature. Veltrax's, a recorded message. She approached, breath unsteady. The machine activated. His voice was quiet, tired. Rayna, if you're hearing this, it means I failed to buy enough time. Or maybe it means I succeeded, just not in the way I hoped. The vault is gone. So is the Prophet. So is everything else. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. I wasn't supposed to live, she whispered. The recording continued. The signal went out. We know that much. But what it's doing, we still don't know. Orks are fragmenting, splintering, losing cohesion. But it's not enough. I can feel it. Like a half-dead war, still clawing at reality's throat. A pause. You have to finish it. She stepped back, stunned. Me? You were always better at seeing the long picture, Rena. I looked at enemies. You looked at systems, structures, cultures. I led the charge. and you made sure there was something left behind. The lights in the room flared, revealing more, data scrolls stacked against the walls. Charts, recordings, all streaming from hidden Vox tabs, watching the collapse unfold. Rayna, the Orks aren't just a war, they're an idea, a living, weaponized belief system. We cracked part of the pattern, but belief doesn't die with a signal, it adapts. And if we don't unravel it fully, then everything we did was just a delay. The message ended. A heavy silence returned. Rayna sank to her knees, not in grief, not even exhaustion, in realization. He was right. She began scanning the data immediately, her mind re-engaging with the speed of a cogitator brought to full burn. Orkish behavior across dozens of sectors, divergent, erratic, the Wa. Energy was destabilized but not eliminated. Pockets of belief still festered. Clusters of cohesion emerged in strange, unnatural places. A dead mech on Sephiron 2 had built a voice amplifier that still whispered across Vox channels, its frequency mimicking battle cries that stirred faint echoes in nearby Ork populations. It was rebuilding belief without understanding it. A statue of Gork, or Mork, had begun bleeding green sap on Vadris Prime, and Orks there had begun praying. Rayna stared at the screen. "This isn't over," she said. And then, without warning, a red light pulsed above the door. Incoming signal. A voice came through, filtered, disguised, yet unmistakable in its presence. "You're alive," her breath caught. "Arcane." "I thought you died on Mars," the voice said, tone unreadable. "But then again, none of you ever stay dead, do you?" She bristled. "If you're here to finish the job, you'll have to try harder than last time." "I'm not," Arcane said. "Not yet." A pause. "Veltrax did something. We don't know what, but it's spreading. And the Inquisition is divided. Some want to destroy every trace of the signal. Others want to study it, weaponize it." "And you?" Rayna asked, her voice a whisper. "I want to know what it really means." Another silence. Then Arcane said, "We found a node. A signal anchor embedded beneath the ruins of Ravnog's cradle. It's transmitting a pulse that doesn't degrade. We think it's stabilizing residual belief." She stiffened. "A stabilizer?" "Yes. And if we shut it down, the remaining Ork gestalt might fracture completely. No war, no belief, no future wars." Her mind raced. "But if it's destroyed without the right counterseed?" "It could backlash," he finished. "Hard. Unite them all again." Her voice hardened. "You want me to help you destroy it?" "No," Arcane said. "I want you to go there. I want you to tell me, is this what Veltrax would have wanted?" The channel went dead. Rayna stood still for a long moment. She felt the cold weight of choice settle around her shoulders. This was not war anymore. This was legacy. She looked to the stars, eyes burning. "Then let's see if your dream survives the light, Veltrax." And she set a course for Ravnox. Far away, beneath the dark moons of Galathan, a weird boy knelt. Green fire hissed from his eyes, and in his mind, a whisper curled. Alien, human, a virus of thought. Is we losing? He did not know who asked it, but for the first time, he had no answer. The descent into Ravnox was not unlike entering the mouth of a dead god. The planet had been lifeless for millennia. Its core had cooled long before mankind's rise, and the crust bore the scars of ancient mining and forgotten battles, wounds that never healed. Great engines of industry once drilled into its bones, pulling secrets from the black stone. Now those structures lay like skeletons, half buried in dust and sorrow. But beneath the surface, something still beat. Talrina stood at the viewport of her shuttle as the vessel broke into the lower atmosphere. The skies above were choked in ash lightning coiled in sickly hues of violet and green, leaking from hidden warp fractures that trembled just out of sight. The machine spirit of the vessel shuddered, protesting its presence on this cursed world. Ravnox was not just dead. It had been emptied, as if something had reached into the crust and pulled out its soul. Approaching anchor sight, intoned the pilot servo. Warning, ambient. Wah, energy detected. Low but rising. Rena narrowed her eyes. Then we're not the only ones here. The thought chilled her. Ever since the vault's destruction, she'd tracked the signal through scraps and whispers, hunting the echoes of Veltrax's last act. What she'd found in the data was horrifying. Evidence of self-replicating psychic anchors, each carrying fragments of Orkish belief, autonomously reinforcing themselves like a cancer made from thought. Ravnox was the largest, a primary node, a metaphysical spinal column connecting the rotting remains of the green tide. And now she would tear it down, but not alone. The shuttle landed on the remains of an orbital freight terminal, its surface choked in broken steel and petrified fungus. As the boarding ramp lowered with a slow hiss, Rena stepped into the half-light, clad in red-adorned combat robes, a plasma pistol holstered at her hip, and a data slate streaming live psychometric feedback clamped to her wrist. The winds howled low and mournful. The scent of old blood and rust filled her nostrils. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. He was already there. Still addicted to ruins, came the voice, dry, sardonic, and laced with weary venom. Harkane. He emerged from the shadows of a ruined pillar, cloak fluttering in the wind, storm bolter mag-locked to his back. The Inquisitor was thinner than she remembered, hollowed by years and betrayal, but his eyes burned with the same calculating fire. Rena didn't smile. You brought backup? None that could be trusted. This place eats loyalty. He paused. We go alone. She studied him. Convenient. He met her gaze without flinching. No one else understands what's at stake. Not really. There was a silence between them, long and hard and bitter. Then, wordlessly, they turned together, heading toward the breach in the surface that yawned like a wound. A metallic chasm lined with rusted walls and twisted scaffolds, where once miners and tech priests dug for secrets beneath Ravnox's surface. Now, it echoed with a different presence, something unnatural. Deeper they went, hour by hour, level by level, following the signal through abandoned machine halls and forgotten vaults. And the deeper they travelled, the louder the thoughts became. Not speech, not language, but presence. A pulsing sensation in the bones, a psychic itch that scraped at the inside of their skulls. It sounded like laughter, or its echo, joyless, maddening, as if belief itself had gone feral and built a nest in the dark. We're close, Rena said, sweat forming at her brow. Too close, Harkane muttered. They entered the final chamber through a sundered blast door. What lay beyond was not machinery, not relics, but a cathedral. Built from scrap metal and fused biomass, it stood like an altar to madness. Orkish glyphs, unreadable yet felt, covered every surface. Totems of teeth and war gear hung from the ceiling like chandeliers. A vast pit opened at the centre, and in its heart floated the anchor. It was not a machine in the traditional sense. It throbbed, glowed green, shaped like a crude orc skull, pulsing with psychic energy. It hovered, suspended by belief alone, unstable yet self-sustaining. The data slate on Rena's arm screamed with warnings. This shouldn't be possible, she breathed. Harkane drew his weapon. And yet here it is. She stared at the anchor, transfixed. Inside it, she felt something. No, someone. Veltrax. Not his mind, not his soul, but a residue. A last act of defiance buried in the code of the signal. A counter seed. An idea designed to unravel Orkish gestalt from within. If they destroyed the anchor now, the signal might collapse entirely, or flare out, catching and reigniting Ork belief across the stars. Don't do it, Rena said suddenly. Harkane froze. What? It's not just a stabilizer. It's a key. Veltrax buried something inside. A final message. A self-replicating thought designed to replace the Orkish drive with doubt. But it needs time. If we destroy it now, they could return in full force. She nodded slowly. But if we leave it too long, they'll adapt, he finished grimly. The choice hung in the air like a blade. Rena stepped forward. Her hand hovered over the terminal linked to the anchor's core. She could input a kill code, or she could let it evolve. Let Veltrax's idea run its course. Behind her, Harkane raised his weapon. You're hesitating. She didn't turn. Because this isn't war anymore. It's a question, what question? Her voice was hollow. Do we let belief die? Or do we try to change it? He lowered the bolter. That's not for us to answer. No, she whispered, but we already are. She keyed in the command, not to destroy, but to delay. The anchor flickered, adjusted. The pulse changed frequency. Across the galaxy, the Orks shuddered. 100,000 warbands paused, heard something they couldn't name. A doubt. They named the ship Divinity Through Ruin. A fitting name, Harkane thought, as he stood alone on the command deck, gazing down at the blighted sphere of Ravnox. The cyclonic warheads were primed, 6 of them, each powerful enough to crack a world's crust and boil its atmosphere. The ship's servitors awaited a final command, and yet he hesitated. Down there, buried beneath the planet's skin, Tal Rena had delayed the destruction of the Ork anchor. She had seeded doubt instead of death, trusted the memory of a fallen Muggles over the certainty of annihilation. Harkane had always known her to be capable of radical thought, but this was something else. He clenched his gloved hands behind his back. His mind drifted to their last words below the surface. We are not gods, Harkane. No, he had replied, but we clean up after them. He closed his eyes. Rena was still on the planet. She had refused to leave until the signal stabilized, until she could be sure that Veltrax's psychic contagion was taking root, replacing belief with entropy, undoing War at its source. He had given her 1 hour. That was 20 minutes ago. Now the countdown ticked in red lumens above his head, and the seconds bled like wounds. He turned to the comms officer. Open a channel. The bridge flickered, then stabilized into Rena's grainy Vox signal. Her voice came through heavy with static and exhaustion. She was covered in soot and blood, half of her gear sparking from exposure to the ambient psychic field. But her eyes still burned with conviction. It's working, she said, breathless. The waveform is decaying. Orkish belief structures are beginning to collapse inward. They're starting to question what? Harkane asked, jaw tight. Each other, their leaders, even the fight itself. That won't last. No, she admitted. But if Veltrax's seed keeps spreading, it might grow faster than they can compensate. Imagine an entire race, engineered for belief, suddenly capable of doubt. He was silent. She continued more softly now. It could change them, Harkane. Make them think. Not all of them, not at once, but over generations. And what if you're wrong, he said. What if the anchor becomes a beacon? A new Wah, larger than anything we've ever seen. Rena looked away. Then you pushed the button. She didn't plead, didn't argue. She gave him the truth and left the weight of it in his hands. The channel cut. Harkane stood still for a long time. He remembered terror. The vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, where he'd first seen a god bleed. He remembered the Martian catacombs and their silent halls of failed experiments. He remembered the horrors of the Octavian Rift, when Orks had believed themselves immortal and by their own belief were. And he remembered Rena. She had believed in logic, in data, in the raw power of systems, but now she was choosing faith, not in gods or legends, but in change, in the possibility that even monsters could evolve, that even war could end. He turned to the launch servitor. Hold fire. Order not recognized, the servitor buzzed. Protocol Gamma Red requires immediate execution upon Wah signal convergence. Harkane approached the console, entered the override code manually. Authorization, Inquisitor, Malchior Harkane. Rescind Gamma Red. Postpone planetary purge. Set review interval for 100 standard years. The ship groaned. The machine spirit protested. But the order held. He stood alone as the warheads powered down, their heat bleeding into the cold belly of the ship. Outside the viewport, Ravnox remained whole, bruised, sickened, but alive, for now. In the depths of the planet, Rena collapsed to her knees as the seismic tremors stilled. The anchor pulsed one final time and fell into quiet rhythm. She could feel it now, the absence of pressure in her skull. The field had shifted, not broken, but fractured, like a mirror cracked by its own reflection. Somewhere far away, a war boss would look at his boys and wonder, for the first time, why he fought. It would take time, maybe centuries. But Veltrax's ghost had started something. Not an end, a beginning. She looked up at the cathedral, blackened and burning, and smiled through the blood on her teeth. Elsewhere, across the stars, change began to ripple. On the forge world of Venax III, Ork mechs tore apart their own machines in confusion, unsure why they no longer worked the way they used to. On the battlefield moons of Gragzul Delta, two warbands stopped mid-charge, arguing in broken low Gothic about who had the right to claim the planet. In the dead city of Ardathus, a lone weird boy screamed as his connection to the Wah wavered, then vanished entirely, replaced by silence and dread. It was beginning, and somewhere in the warp, something ancient and hungry took notice. Not the Ork gods, not Gork or Mork. They remained brutal and ignorant in their own dimensions, clawing at each other with endless rage. But other powers, subtler things, stirred, things that thrived on doubt. Back aboard Divinity Through Ruin, Harkane sat alone in the inquisitorial sanctum. He had filed his report under sealed protocol. He had lied, said Ravnox's signal collapsed, said the anchor had been destroyed. He would be executed if they discovered the truth. But in the quiet of the sanctum, he read Veltrax's final transmission again. Not a data log, not a map, but a question. What happens when you teach a storm to doubt the wind? Harkane closed his eyes. He didn't know the answer, but he would live long enough to find out. For doubt, once planted, did not die easily, not even in war, not even in the Wah, not even in the heart of the Imperium itself. There were whispers on the windless moons of Cygnus Ferren, a fortress world, once stalwart and brimming with the might of Astra Militarum, now lay silent beneath a pall of red ash. The Orks had come, as they always did, But they hadn't left with laughter and blood. They had left with silence, a silence that spread. From system to system, it moved not like a fleet or plague, but like forgetting. Where banners once flew there were now broken glyphs, scrawled over by confused hands. War bands that once roared into battle now sat idle, muttering to themselves or turning on one another, not with fury, but with disquiet. Across the Imperium, reports arrived. Inquisitors began to notice. Some whispered of a psychic sickness. Others claimed it a punishment from the Emperor, a slow disarming of the green tide. But Inquisitor Malchior Harkane knew better. He had seen the fracture. He had caused it. And now its ripples were no longer subtle. They were tidal. On the bridge of the Divinity through Ruin, Harkane watched the data feed spiral in from the outer sectors. Anomalies were no longer confined to Ravnox. In Segmentum Tempestus, an entire Ork moon world had stopped functioning. Its fusion core lay dormant. Its mechs, still alive, sat in circles, drawing in dirt with broken fingers, as though searching for something they couldn't name. He turned as Reyna entered the chamber, her gait uneven, a cane now at her side. The exposure on Ravnox had damaged more than her lungs. It had scarred her DNA, aging her, unraveling her biology like old thread. But her eyes still burned, not with fire, but with clarity. "They're unraveling," she said, setting a data slate on the table. "Across 3 sectors. Wah! Energy is fluctuating, not dropping, but wobbling. A pattern of uncertainty has emerged. It's destabilizing their belief scaffolds." "You sound like Veltrax," Harkane replied. "I should," she said. "I finished decoding his final work." She tapped the slate. A web of interlocking psychic frequencies appeared, a spiral of equations and visualized distortions. At the center, a signature, not Veltrax's, something older. "He didn't create the doubt," she said. "He found it." Harkane frowned. "Explain." Deep beneath Ravnox, beneath the cathedral ruins, there was something older than the Imperium, older than humanity. Veltrax's notes suggest it was a vault, or perhaps a tomb, built to contain, not an entity exactly. A concept. He looked at her sharply. "You're speaking like an Eldar now." "They were right about some things," she said softly. "It's not a weapon in the traditional sense. It's an idea carved into psychic space, a mimetic artifact so potent that it bleeds into belief systems. It doesn't destroy energy. It corrupts its foundation, conviction, turns certainty into inquiry." She paused. "Turns violence into introspection." Harkane stared at the swirling data. "You mean to say we didn't defeat the Orks?" "We infected them," she nodded. "And now it's spreading." On the Ork-held planet of Shakrol Prime, war ground to a halt. War boss Throg Urgut stood amidst the ruins of a collapsed Hab city, his claw dripping with blood. Around him, his boys shuffled, confused. The enemy had stopped firing hours ago. Humans. Weak things. But they had done something unforgivable. They had surrendered, not cowardly, not whimpering. They had walked from their trenches, hands open, eyes clear, and talked. And now Throg could not stop thinking about what they said. "They built this city for their children," he muttered to himself. "Not for fighting, but living." He clutched his head. "That's not right." He punched a nearby knob in frustration, but it was half-hearted. His claw didn't crush as it should. The rage wasn't there. Behind him, one of his weird boys fell to the ground, screaming in Old Ork. The others backed away in confusion. They had no words for it, but the truth sank like rust in their bones. The fight had changed. Back in orbit, Harkane and Rena stood at the viewport, watching the warp shimmer beyond. "You realize what we've done," she said, voice low. "Yes," Harkane replied. "We've broken the galaxy's balance." The Orks were the constant, the wild variable, the universal predator. Without them, everything shifts. They were a disease, he said. "And we offered a cure." Rena shook her head. "No, we offered a mirror." He turned to her. "And what if they survive this? Change. Become something worse. Then we'll face that consequence," she said. "But at least it will be new. Not this endless cycle. Not war for its own sake." He considered that. For 10,000 years the Imperium had fought the Orks, like waves crashing against stone. The Orks did not die. They did not change. They simply grew louder. But now there were questions in their minds. He wondered if the same seed might one day find root in humanity. And what then? Far beyond, on a dead Eldar craft world drifting through the void, a shadow stirred. It had watched the rise of men and the fall of gods. It had seen Orks born of war and fed by faith. And now it saw something new, a species infected by the virus of doubt. It did not smile, for it had no mouth, but it moved, for the first time in aeons. For change, true change, was rare, and in that rarity there was opportunity. Inquisitor Malchior Harkane sat in his sanctum once more, finalizing his report. He stared at the concluding paragraph, then slowly deleted it. Some truths did not belong in archives. Some changes had to be felt, not documented. He closed the data slate. Outside, the warp whispered, and in its whispers, a single question echoed through the darkness. What happens when you teach a storm to dream? The Ork moon world of Gragtazun spun silently above the graveyard planet of Demuth, a bloated husk of junk metal, scrap towers, and half-breathing mech skins fused into cogitator hives. Once it had sung with the rhythm of war, clanging forges, stomping gargants, and roars of a million boys preparing for the next wah. Now it moaned. Across the metallic ridges, Orks wandered like ghosts through their own temples of violence, their tusks grinding not with hunger for battle, but with unease. Many no longer spoke. The few who did muttered incoherently, as if language itself were dissolving in their mouths. War boss Grolmaka Skullgrin, who had once taken 3 subsectors in 5 weeks, now sat alone in his thrown-together throne, slumped, a gargantuan claw idly carving a spiral into the metal floor. He didn't know why he was drawing spirals, but he couldn't stop. Above him, the glyphs that once burned with raw belief, symbols of Gork Mork and unending fight, flickered, dimmed, and fell away like flakes of rust. He stared at the crude idol to Gork he'd built years ago, its face now smeared, half erased by weather and time. "Where'd you go?" he rasped. "What did I do wrong?" No voice answered, not even in his head. On the deck of the Divinity Through Ruin, Rayna leaned heavily against a rail, her skin paler than bone, her voice thinner with each day. But her mind still flared sharp as void glass. "The infection's accelerating," she whispered, watching Ork system relays collapse one by one on the holomap. "They're forgetting their gods." Harkane stood beside her, hands behind his back. "No, they're remembering they invented them." She gave him a sideways glance. "You say that like it's a good thing." He didn't reply immediately. His eyes remained locked on the data. Red blips, Ork signal worlds, were vanishing. not from destruction, from irrelevance, as though belief was all that tethered them to reality, and that tether had finally snapped. They've always been dangerous because of their simplicity, Harkane finally said. Faith, instinct, aggression, it all merged into something unstoppable. But now they're learning uncertainty, thought, reflection. He turned toward her. You know what that means, don't you? She nodded slowly. They'll stop being orcs. Not all, he said, but enough. The collapse did not go unnoticed. From the dark corners of the galaxy, ancient minds stirred. Eldar farses saw the threads of fate twist unnaturally, becoming frayed, coiling around something unknown. In the temples of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Archmagos Krythe translated deep noospheric patterns and whispered heresy into vox voids. That entropy itself had been modified, and in the halls of terror, the High Lord stared in silence as the Orc front across the Ghast Halo arm simply vanished. A void that had never before existed in Imperial history. There was no enemy, no battle, just quiet, too much of it. But not all Orcs were succumbing. There were outliers, survivors, resistant echoes. In the jungles of Ormgon Delta, war boss Cracker Grog, a relic of the old ways, still rallied his boys. His weird boys bled from the ears, but they could still scream, "Wah!" into the void. His knobs twitched, but they obeyed. He chained his boys in place, beat them with glyph rods until the fire came back in their eyes. He called it the purging of thinking, and it worked, temporarily. But even he could feel the drag, like fighting in a dream where the ground is made of oil and gravity shifts sideways. The instinct was fading. The urge was leaking out. "We'll burn the thoughts out to us," he spat, eyes burning with madness. "We'll smash till the smashing comes back." But it didn't. Not really. Back aboard the Divinity, Rena was dying. The exposure to the psychic engine beneath Ravnox had done what no Xenos weapon could. Her organs were failing. Time unraveled differently in her blood. Yet she smiled. She smiled because she had seen something no one else had. Hope. Not the false hope of the ecclesiarchy, nor the distant lies of the Emperor's will. A different kind of hope. The kind that comes from change. Harkane sat beside her, a rare moment of quiet between them. "I read the translation," he said softly. "The one from Veltrax's tomb." She nodded faintly. "And it wasn't a weapon. It was a prayer, repeated so many times it became alive. But it wasn't a prayer to something." He looked at her, eyes unreadable. It was a prayer against certainty. Rena chuckled. A prayer of doubt. The most dangerous thing in the galaxy. They sat in silence. Above them, warp storms shifted. In them, strange colors bloomed. Not the screaming, blood-hued rage of Khorne, or the writhing colors of Tzeentch, but pale, subtle hues. The colors of indecision, of hesitation. Even the warp was watching. In the ruined temple of Megalgrot on Derek's 4, a single orc stared into a broken mirror. He was a pain boy, though he no longer remembered what that meant. His name was gone. His tools lay rusting on the floor. But he kept drawing. Spirals, circles, questions. Around him, other orcs gathered. Quiet, thoughtful. He stood slowly. "We ain't got to smash all our time," he muttered. We can build something. Not for fighting," he faltered, "but for staying." No one laughed. No one hit him. They just listened. And in that silence, something ancient and terrible began to mourn. Not the Imperium, not the Eldar, not chaos, but the Wa itself, as if some primal force within the Orcs, the gestalt energy of their race, felt itself slipping away, eroding. becoming, questioned, and it wept, not with tears, but with silence. The galaxy held its breath. In the quiet that followed, new patterns began to emerge. Dreams that weren't made of steel and blood. Ideas that did not end with a chopper. And in the deepest places of the warp, something alien, something old, took shape. Not a god, not a monster, but a question. What if the storm does not want to rage anymore? The divinity through ruin descended slowly through the pale atmosphere of Demuth. The moon's surface, once scorched by war and choked with the roar of orcish engines, now whispered with the eerie hush of abandonment. Great statues of Gork and Mork lay toppled, half buried in dunes of rust. The red haze of the dying star overhead cast the ruins in hues of blood and regret. Inside the vessel's command sanctum, the air was sharp with silence. Harkane stood over the projection of the battlefield below, but there were no armies waiting for him, no defences, no roars of war, just the quiet and the wounded echo of something that had once been magnificent in its monstrosity. Behind him, Rayna sat in her chair, her voice failing, her body a whisper of what it had been. "You shouldn't be here," he said without turning. "Your body's failing." "I've already died once," she replied with a faint smile. "I don't intend to miss the moment we win." He turned to her then, really looked at her. Her eyes, though dimmed, still held clarity, still burned with purpose. But behind that fire was a resignation, one she hadn't shared aloud. "You knew this would cost you," he said. "I did. Why keep going?" Her smile turned inward. "Because I had to know if doubt could unmake gods." There was no defiance in her voice, just truth. The last war council gathered in silence, not aboard a ship of conquest, but among the broken spires of what had once been a Wa citadel. Only a handful of orcs remained here, more shadows than warriors. Grolmarker Skullgrin, once a mountain of fury, now leaned heavily on a rusted chain blade. His eyes were glassy, his thoughts drifting. "You brought this on us," he grunted at Harkane, who stood before him without armour, unarmed. "All this, quiet, all this thinking." "I didn't bring it," Harkane answered softly. "You were always going to reach this point. I only showed you what was waiting." The war boss's claw twitched. "We was made to fight. It's what we are." "And if that's a lie," Rena said, her voice weak as wind. "If you were shaped by war, not born of it." Grolmarker staggered, like the idea itself had struck him. "Then what are we?" he croaked. No one answered, not the boys behind him, who looked to one another with uncertain eyes. Not the weird boys, who stood at the temple's shattered gate, whispering to winds that no longer carried prophecy. Not even the half-finished gargant shell that loomed above them, its eyes dead, its mouth silent. The orcs had always known who they were, until now. In the vaults beneath Demuth, deep where the psychic wound of the Ravnox machine still bled into the real, Harkane and Rena descended together for the final time. Each step cracked beneath them, echoing through tunnels where the air shimmered with half-reality. The psychic engine had fractured more than the orcs. It had opened something deeper, older. "I feel it again," Rena whispered. "The question." "What question?" he asked. She stopped. "What if we're not supposed to win?" He didn't understand. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, tired, sick, and yet radiant with clarity. "We've spent millennia trying to destroy the orcs. Crusades, purges, exterminatus. But nothing worked because we kept attacking their bodies, not their minds, and now they're unraveling. he said. But it's not just them, Harkane. She touched the wall, where ancient orc glyphs were slowly smoothing into unmarked stone. They were the mirror. We shaped them, fed them, needed them to be monsters. He stepped back. You think we're complicit? I think we believed in their monstrosity as much as they did. And in that moment, standing above the ancient heart of the war, the truth dawned like a second sun. The Orks were not just victims of their own psychic gestalt. They were entangled with the belief of their enemies. The galaxy had willed them to be beasts, and beasts they became. But now, belief was changing, not because of war, but because of choice, and that change had a cost. Outside, in the remains of the citadel, Grolmaka raised his claw to the sky one last time. The boys gathered, less out of fear, more out of habit. Some still carried weapons, though few had fired them in weeks. Their eyes were cloudy, their glyphs faded. Listen, you gits, he barked. I don't know what's happening. I don't know why we stopped wanting to crump, but I ain't gonna fade like this. I won't. He turned his gaze upward to the rust-coloured star. If Gork and Mork is listening, if you're still out there, then give me a sign. There was no thunder, no lightning, only wind. And then, faintly, a voice, not from the sky, from within. There is no Gork, no Mork, only you. His knees buckled. His boys fell to silence, and in that silence, something ancient died. The Ravnok's core pulsed, slow and dim, like a heart that had beat for 1,000,000 years, now easing to rest. Rayna stepped into the chamber alone, her skin aglow with psychic light. She knew she wouldn't leave. I can't go with you, she said softly to Harkane. Not anymore. He reached for her, but stopped. You knew this. She smiled. I chose this. And as she stepped into the light, her body unravelling into thought and memory and will, she whispered the final line of the Veltrax text. May all who dream of war awaken in peace, the machine answered. It did not roar, it did not sing, it sighed. And across the stars, orcs everywhere paused. Some dropped their weapons, others sat down, and a few, only a few, wept. Not because they were defeated, but because they finally understood what they were. Chati. High above Damoth, aboard the retreating divinity through ruin, Harkane stood alone at the viewport. The war was over, not because they had won, but because the Orks had chosen to stop fighting. But he felt no triumph, only a terrible, aching sorrow. Because the question remained, what happens to the galaxy when its monsters decide not to be monsters anymore? And what does that make us? The galaxy held its breath. Across the void, Orc warbands had fallen into disarray, not through defeat but through dissipation. Hulking war bosses turned their eyes to rusted weapons and asked questions no Orc had ever asked. What now? Planets once braced for invasion were met with silence. The war was dying, not from war, but from awakening. And the Imperium, once resolute in its hatred, now stood before a mirror it had spent 10,000 years shattering. Harkane stared at the hololith. The latest reports were a storm of confusion. Orc enclaves turning inward, some collapsing into ruin, others building strange temples in utter silence. The green tide had ebbed, but with its recession came unease. What are they doing? Whispered one of the tacticians behind him. Harkane didn't answer. He didn't know. Rayna's absence lingered like a wound that wouldn't heal. The Ravnok's core had consumed her, no, transformed her. She had become something more, something incorporeal, a whisper in the psychic firmament. He could still hear her voice sometimes in his dreams, or in the quiet moments when the void seemed too still. But today, she was silent. The ship's doors hissed open. A presence entered without announcing itself. Harkane turned, and the breath caught in his throat. It was Lord Inquisitor Varn, his former mentor, his betrayer, the man who had once branded him a heretic for daring to speak the idea that the Orks were not unchangeable, the man who had unleashed the Red Sanctum upon Rayna's homeworld, sacrificing billions to preserve the illusion that war was inevitable. Harkane, Varn said, his voice cold, measured, eternal. You're already dead, Harkane replied. I saw you fall on Artraxis. I saw the flames take you. Varn stepped closer, his cloak immaculate, his face untouched by time. His eyes gleamed with a terrible certainty. You saw a man die, Varn said. Not what I became. Not what I was always meant to be. Harkane felt the pressure of something vast behind those words. Not warp, not machine. Something in between. A gestalt of belief, like the Orks, but darker, more human. You merged, Harkane said slowly, with the god pattern. Not a god. A narrative, Varn said, almost tenderly. The Imperium is not held together by truth. It is bound by myth, by necessary lies. And the greatest of them is this, that monsters are born, not made. The air shimmered around him. His shadow stretched in unnatural ways, as if 1,000 versions of him were superimposed over his form. You undid the Orks, Varn said. You freed them from the lie. And now the galaxy falters because it was built to need them. What do you think fills the void left behind? Harkane clenched his fists. You. No, Varn said. Us. He extended a hand, not in threat, but invitation. You and I both know peace is unsustainable. The galaxy was built on war. Peace is the aberration. War is the constant no, Harkane whispered. That's the lie. It's the truth we chose. And belief is power. Harkane stepped back. The room darkened, the stars beyond the viewport fading behind an aurora of shimmering thought forms. He realized then what Varn truly was. Not a man, not even a mind, but a manifestation of belief. Just as the Orks had shaped their gods, so too had the Imperium shaped its monsters. You killed her, Harkane said. Varn smiled. She chose to transcend. She did not survive the truth, no, Harkane said, eyes blazing. She became it. And then the room screamed, not with sound, with memory. Rayna's voice swept through the chamber, not as a ghost, but as a thought form, an echo of will. You are not the shape of man, she said through the rising storm of psychic backlash. You are the cage he built for himself. Light tore through the command center as Varn staggered. For a moment, his form flickered, one face splitting into many, a cardinal, a lord commander, a saint, a warlord, all the faces that had justified cruelty in the name of unity. Harkane reached for the command node, not to fire weapons, not to escape, but to open the psychic core. He would let truth in, even if it unmade them all. Stop, Varn snarled. You'll tear apart the veil. Then let it tear, Harkane whispered, and he pressed his hand to the node. The psychic burst that followed did not rend the ship. It unraveled the lie. Across the stars, imperial planets felt a ripple. It wasn't death. It was doubt. Deep, soul-shaking doubt. The kind of doubt that questioned not just enemies, but identity. What they were told to be. The ecclesiarchy choked on its sermons. The mechanicus found their logic loops corrupted by recursion. Even the Inquisition, most insulated of all, felt the shift. Files redacted by instinct, memories blurring, names lost to contradiction. And at the center of it all, aboard a vessel adrift above Demuth, two men stood within the eye of an unraveling myth. Varn dropped to his knees, I held it together, he gasped. For millennia, I was the spine of history. And history doesn't care, Harkane said. Varn looked up, tears streaming down his perfect face. If we are not monsters, then what are we? Harkane looked past him, toward the stars now reigniting. Maybe we're something new. Varn crumbled, not in blood, but in concept. His body collapsed into 1,000 conflicting stories, none of them strong enough to stand alone. He dissolved into mist, into absence, a void where certainty used to be. Harkane emerged from the sanctum alone. The crew did not cheer. They did not understand what had just happened, but they felt the change. The galaxy no longer needed the Orks to be monsters, and with that need gone, something else had begun. Not peace, not war, possibility. As the ship began its retreat from Demuth, Harkane sat in Rena's chair, now empty. He looked to the stars and whispered her name, and in the quiet that followed, he heard her answer. We don't need to win the war. We only need to end the need for one. The future loomed, terrifying, beautiful, unknown. In the silence after war, there is not peace. There is reckoning. The galaxy, immense, fractured and weary, spun slowly beneath the dying breath of 1,000 suns. The Ork, Wah, once an all-consuming flood, had receded into legend. Not vanquished by weapons or flame, but by something far stranger. By truth. What remained in its wake was not unity, nor triumph, but stillness. And into that stillness stepped Harkane, the architect of an end no one could name. The ship drifted above the ruins of Demuth, no longer a war machine, no longer bound to conquest. Its Vox relays were silent now. There was no need to broadcast a victory no one would understand. Harkane stood at the observation deck, alone. Below him, the world burned itself out, not in fire, but in memory. Millions of Orks wandering aimlessly, not fighting, not building, not believing. Their gods, Gork and Mork, had not died. They had simply ceased to matter. Without belief, even gods crumble. He could still hear echoes of Rena, fragments scattered across the psychic weave, like starlight too old to name. She was gone, but not lost. Transcended, perhaps, or sacrificed. He no longer knew where those lines began or ended. All he knew was that her dream had come true. The green tide had turned, but at what cost? Across the Imperium, old structures teetered. Battle priests spoke sermons to empty cathedrals. Inquisitors found heresies harder to name. Without the Orks as eternal enemies, without their chaos to justify cruelty, the foundations of the Imperium began to decay from within. On some worlds, statues of slain Ork war bosses were quietly removed. On others, humans began to question the stories passed down in blood and fire. And still, Harkane remained silent. He had been offered immortality in many forms, first by the Orks, then by Varn, and even in Rena's final light. Each time he had refused, not out of nobility, but because he had come to understand its cost. Immortality was not life without death. It was life without change. And change, for all its horror, was necessary. One night, if such a term still held meaning in orbit, he returned to the sanctum where Rena had disappeared. The psychic core still hummed with residual light, her essence woven through its lattice like strands of soul fire. He reached toward it, not to reactivate, but to speak. Not to her, but to himself. I thought ending the war would feel like victory, he said aloud. But there's no ending. Just a silence where we once shouted. The room did not answer, but a small green sprout had broken through a crack in the floor. He blinked, stepped closer. in sterile metal, in artificial light, something living had taken root, not by command, not by belief, but by chance, by possibility. He knelt beside it, and for the first time in years he laughed, not out of joy, not out of triumph, but out of awe. The Orks had once believed war was the only truth. The Imperium had made the same mistake, and he, too, had believed that ending war meant ending them. But maybe, he thought, war wasn't the final lie. Maybe inevitability was. He left the sprout where it was, a symbol not of peace, but of a world not yet defined. Outside, the stars burned on, and below, across the galaxy, Orks began to remember things they had forgotten. Not war, not conquest, but curiosity. They looked to the skies not with hunger, but wonder. Some even built ships not for invasion, but exploration. A few spoke of new gods. Others stopped speaking of gods entirely. In a hidden chamber on Terra, the High Lords debated furiously. The Ecclesiarchy burned new heretics. The Inquisition began to fracture into factions, those who still clung to the past, and those who believed something new was emerging. And in that fracture, something ancient stirred. The warp, unbound from predictable war, twisted into new shapes. New horrors would come, new empires, new monsters. But this time, they would not rise from belief in inevitability. They would rise from choice. Harkane returned to his quarters one final time. The lights were dim, the walls lined with old memory scrolls and broken relics of the Crusade. He removed the last piece of his armor, laid it gently beside Rena's old data slate, and sat down before the viewport. He had nothing left to fight, and for the first time, that did not feel like failure. He closed his eyes and dreamed, not of war, but of stars blooming. In the void beyond systems, in the dark where light had not yet reached, an orc stood alone on a dead moon. He was massive, older than any boy had a right to be. His skin was scarred with glyphs no longer used. In his hand, he held a hammer, but he did not swing it. He looked at the stars, brow furrowed. Something deep inside him stirred. A memory of silence. He turned to his grot, who sat scratching nonsense in the dust. "Oi," he grunted. "What if we built something?" The grot blinked. "Built what, boss?" The orc looked up again. "Dunno, just build." And so he did. One stone, then another, and somewhere, in the weave, between warp and real space, Rena smiled. Not because the orcs were cured, not because peace had won, but because for the first time, someone had chosen something else. And that choice, fragile and uncertain, was enough.